So we've been going through, and we will be for the next forever, on discovering God's will. We're looking at all of the explicit verses that plainly say what God's will is for us and in general. We've talked about being a family, desiring the company of Christians, spirit-filled prayer, renewing our mind. Last week we talked about peace among the brethren. And right now we're all at peace. The coffee hasn't hit in yet. We'll see if that peace maintains once we're all caffeinated. But today I want to look at God-ordained leadership. 1 Corinthians 1:1. Paul, called as an apostle of Jesus Christ by, you guessed it, the will of God, and Sosthenes, our brother. We're not going to really worry about Sosthenes. But we're going to look at Paul, who was called as an apostle by the will of God. So in this greeting to 1 Corinthians, Paul lists his qualifications as an apostle. And he makes it known that the office of apostle was not given to him by man. He wasn't just taken to Jerusalem and said, all right, Paul, you seem pretty with it. You're an apostle now. You've got the title. That's not the way someone got the title of apostle. Paul here was appointed an apostle by Jesus himself and occurred through the will of God. Just like I find it interesting that Paul talks about being trained in the faith for 3 years, and he wasn't in Jerusalem being trained up by the apostles. It seems to me like Jesus was training him himself. Mm-hmm. But the fact is that a godly leader can only be what he is by the will of God. That is to say, we've seen people who are great leaders. Attila the Hun was a great leader. He was good at being a leader, a violent man. We look at Alexander the Conqueror, who up before the Roman Empire conquered everything and primed it for Rome to come in and become a worldwide power. Alexander the Great was a fantastic leader. His men followed him. They did what he said. They conquered the known world. But Alexander the Great was a drunk, and he died early. He was not a good man. But godly leadership can only be by the will of God. So that is to say, you can tell when someone in charge is there by a human appointment rather than a divine selection. We have very strict guidelines in the Bible for qualifying for leadership. You look at the qualifications to be an elder, and there's some hard qualifications to meet. And what's interesting too is that none of the qualifications of leader talk about wanting to look at resumes or what can you bring to the table. This is what your life must be like. It's not the skills you have, it's the life you're living. So it kind of makes me think that God isn't so much worried about what you can do, but how you're doing it. Because God can just give you the gifts later. So whenever you see churches all across, you hear me talk about the Western world all the time. I'll tell you why, because I don't really know what's going on in the East. A lot of orthodoxy is going on in the East, and then a lot of Buddhism is going on east of that. So it's not as Christian-minded as, I guess, the Western world. The Western world was more shaped on a foundation of Christian ideals. The Eastern world, the Eastern, what I'll claim is Greece up to Russia, where Orthodoxy reigns, it has kind of a Christian undertones, but there's also a lot of paganism mixed in with that. For example, in Orthodoxy, it reminds me of a story where an Orthodox church was being planted in the States, and a man came in who was not Orthodox and was asking about it, kind of, tell me what this is, tell me what this is. And he said, why aren't the doors open yet? It looks like the building's complete. And the priest said, oh, we can't open the doors until the relics arrive. Until we have something to worship, we can't worship. So a lot of paganism in with Eastern Orthodoxy. Maybe one day we'll go through history there. They had a hard time conquering Russia and forcing Christianity on Russia, so they had to make some changes on there. That's where we get Christmas from, actually. The Russians were the ones that started chopping down trees, so buy one from Walmart and maybe then we're not communists. I don't know how that works. Capitalism for the win. But anyway, we're getting off subject. I'm going off on a nerd tangent. But the fact is that churches across the Western world are filled with men that are abundantly, or at least they feel like they are abundantly qualified for positions of leadership because of, for example, their charisma. We have this term that I absolutely abhor, and that term is celebrity pastors. I hate that. I hate the term celebrity pastors. And what's interesting is that very popular men that I enjoy listening to their sermons aren't called this. Tozer was never called a celebrity pastor. Billy Graham was never called a celebrity pastor. John MacArthur is not called a celebrity pastor. R.C. Sproul was not called a celebrity pastor. But then you have other folks like, the worst one I can think of would be Driscoll with Mars Hill, which, by the way, there's a podcast. If y'all like listening to podcasts, it's called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. It is put on by Christianity Today. It's kind of a documentary type thing talking about Driscoll, and my good, the man just wanted power. He just wanted power. But anyway, that has nothing to do with anything. Maybe Driscoll's turned his life around. I hope so. But anyway, celebrity pastors. Look at the Olsteins. Look at Creflo Dollar. Dollar's in his name. And then the T.D. Jakes. Oh man, some of the content that they're putting out, entertaining? Sure. It is entertaining, but the Bible doesn't call for us to be entertained. It calls for us to be obedient. So these folks, they feel that they're qualified because they're celebrities. They're charismatic. Man, I can draw a crowd. Look, I would rather preach to 3 or 4 than to preach to 500 that didn't listen. Amen. I would rather preach to a faithful few than to preach to all of North Georgia, knowing that once they're done listening or not listening, they're just going to go home back to their debauchery. That's not uplifting at all. So these celebrity pastors, they feel they're qualified because, hey, I have 1,000 people in my church. Well, then that's 1,000 people that God has appointed for you to be shepherding their souls. What are you doing to do it? Some of the other ones that I talked about that are not called celebrity pastors, they had big churches. Spurgeon, he had a big church. What did these men do? They were concerned for their flock, so they would have other elders, kind of other shepherds to help them. They would do kind of like what Moses did, where Moses would be sitting and every single person in Israel would line up and he would judge them. And then his father-in-law comes and is like, why don't you appoint judges over districts so that instead of judging every single person every single day like a moron, you could get this stuff done quicker? And Moses was like, yeah, you smart. He liked his father-in-law, but apparently he didn't much care for his wife because he sends her home. Moses wasn't a saint, except by God's will. So we have these men who are concerned for their flock, and they know I can't be everywhere at once with all these people. So I'm still going to do it, but I'm going to have people that'll help as well, and deacons as well that can help me do. And that's exactly what the apostles did. They said, man, we have to be doing all this studying and all. We need servants. We need deacons to help us out. And the office of a deacon is very, just to serve requires a life held to a very high standard. But we have these celebrity pastors that they don't care about that. They don't care about that. It's the fame. And so they honestly aren't qualified. I believe it was Stephen Furtick that someone asked John MacArthur one time, said, in one word, define Stephen Furtick. And MacArthur thought for a minute. He came back and he said, unqualified. So Stephen Furtick, I think it was Furtick, he wrote a book about it. He's like, you should feel unqualified because you should be humble. No! We have clear guidelines on what leadership is to do. Strive to reach those things. It's good for the man to desire the office of an elder. Don't be fake humble. It's okay. But anyway, that has nothing to do with anything. Their charisma, their education. People think that their education puts them to a point of leadership. I mean, you can go to seminaries and get church planting degrees where they teach you the best ways to plant churches. I'll draw this back to MacArthur again because I like him. He said in an interview one time that his church had really grown, and he said that these seminaries would send people to his church to observe, to see how he was doing it. And he said that one of the college students asked him one time, said, John, he said, I can't figure it out. What's your secret to growing this church? And MacArthur said, I'm not desiring to grow the church. I'm just desiring to faithfully preach the gospel to the best of my ability, the best I can. And I hold my staff to that same standard. And these kids just couldn't believe being faithful grows churches. God blesses the faithful. Couldn't believe it. Well, there's got to be an underlying strategy. There's no strategy. Just do what God says and prove that you can be responsible for souls, and He might just send you some. So an education does not necessarily qualify you for leadership. The apostles were, honestly, what would we consider ignorant. They had jobs like fisherman, farmer. I mean, a tax collector might have been educated, but considered dishonest. But think about that. Whenever Jesus was born, God doesn't go to the educated. He goes to the shepherds, which the shepherds tended to be, at this time in history, most of them weren't literate. Most of them were kind of rough dudes. We could draw an equivalency to like construction workers today. If it was in a modern day, Christ would have went to construction workers, to a job site, and like, hey, come see my son. Oh, okay. Put your cigarette down, and here we go. So that's what the shepherds did. Education does not equate intelligence. I'm just going to put that out there. Let me rephrase it. Education does not equate to wisdom. I'm going to put that in a deeper context because intelligence is kind of surface level. Let's go down into wisdom. True wisdom comes from God. People think they're qualified because of their connections. Family connections, community, political connections. It makes me think of, was it Billy Graham's son-in-law, Tullian Tchividjian? Spell that. He ended up proving he was not qualified with sexual sin. Which a lot of people try to push this stuff under the rug, but I don't get it. Because, I mean, Spurgeon never had like a secret skeleton in the closet, and he preached for a bajillion years. Tozer never had a skeleton in the closet. R.C. Sproul just died a few years ago, and no big allegations came out against him. He was just faithful his whole life. So don't tell me you can't do it. because we see men that do it. But these folks, they have these family connections and they think, well, my dad's a pastor, so I could be a pastor. That's not necessarily all the way it goes. Now, sometimes God does call families, and I think that's cool. And then other times you have weird situations like mine, where I have a family full of heavy equipment operators, and then God chooses me to be artsy and speaking. I don't get how that happens, but it happens. Or kind of a community, listening to Voddie Baucham talk about, JB will send me Voddie Baucham all the time, and every time it makes you feel bad listening to what he has to say, because you realize, man, I'm not up to that standard. But the community, he talked about how you'll have young kids in churches, and for some reason people have this idea that it's okay to just have a surface level knowledge of the scriptures, that it's okay to always drink milk, to always be bottle fed and never grow in the faith, that it's okay to have a juvenile elementary understanding of God and His Word. And he said these kids will get saved, and then they'll get excited, and they'll start wanting to read the Bible, and they'll start wanting to study church history, and I want to know more, and I want to know more, I want to know more. And they'll go to these older men in the churches, and they'll say, teach me more, teach me more. And those men, because they don't know, they'll say, well, I guess since you want to study in depth, God must be calling you to be a preacher. You should be a preacher. No! They should be a Christian. That's what a Christian does. When you get saved and you have this head-on collision with God, the very God of the universe, the most powerful force in existence, of course you should desire to read His Word and hear what He has to say. Of course you should desire to know what's happened through the history of Christianity so that you don't repeat the same mistakes. Kind of like our secular world should probably read a little bit of history so they don't make the same mistakes. That's free. That's free. Y'all can put that in your pocket and take it with you. But a community does not qualify you for godly leadership. Some do it for political gain. I said Wednesday, I'll say it again, and I'll say it till the day I die. The older I get, the more I realize people desire power. And it doesn't even matter what kind of power it is. How many fathers do you know that are just tyrants at home because they think the power goes to their head? How many bosses have y'all worked for that are just terrible over minor things because they lack the control? How many politicians? I won't go there. But anyway, so what we have is that connections don't equate to qualifications. Now, the fact is, I've been talking about qualifications to be a leader in God's church. There's a lot of them. I'm going to list them for you. 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7. I think those are the only ones I wrote down. Yeah, I didn't go to Titus. You have to be above reproach to be an elder. You're not wicked. To be above reproach means that people don't talk about you in a negative way. Let me rephrase that. People don't talk about your sins. People may say, and probably will say, if you're above reproach, they just think they're better than everybody. That doesn't mean you do, but that means that you're living a lifestyle that they can't say, well, I can't believe they did this. I can't believe they did this. I can't believe they did this. And honestly, I've told people before, because people get into all kinds of trouble, it's pretty easy to not get in trouble. You just do what you're supposed to do. I mean, it's pretty easy to not cheat on your wife. You just don't. You don't put yourself in that situation. It's pretty easy not to steal. You just don't. You just work, and you're responsible with your money so that you're not starving to death. You have to be the husband of one wife. That literally translates to a one-woman man. You have one woman, and that's your woman. You don't have 4 or 5. Solomon could not have been an elder in the church. Because that poor boy had quite too many. I don't understand Solomon, because I've got one wife. I can't handle her. I can't imagine having 700. Imagine if one of them left, the child support would be ridiculous. Solomon's alimony. That's probably going to be a book at some point. Solomon's alimony. They have to be temperate. That's mature and self-restraining. They can't fly off the handle at everything. Is there a time for godly wrath? Yeah, there is. Jesus flipped over some tables, man. So there's even expressive wrath that you can show. Jesus he was filled with zeal, the Old Testament says, for God's house. So yeah, there's time for anger, but temperate. That is to say, you're not always angry. But also, let's go to the other hand. You're not always peace either. You're temperate. You're in the middle. Sometimes that needle will swing this way. Sometimes that needle will swing this way. But guess what? It hangs out in the middle. You're mature and you're self-restraining. I feel like one of we have multiple words that go along with this word elder. Presbyter, pastor, elder. These things we have bishop. That one's my favorite. I'm going to start calling Kevin Bishop. Bishop K. Bishop. Now that sounds terrible. But anyway, so maturity. There's a reason I think that elder is one of the words we use, because elder tends to denote that you're older. And I mean, the youngest elder that we hear of in the scriptures is Timothy. And he had to tell Timothy, don't let them despise your youth. But Timothy had been trained by Paul himself. And honestly, if we're going to be serious, we have a ton of Paul's writings. We can be trained by Paul himself too. So we can be in the same boat as Timothy. But elder makes this idea of older. You're older. You're more mature. You've been through life a little bit. So you're not so wish-washy. And you're self-restraining. When somebody does something stupid, you don't hit them. It reminds me of a video JB sent me one time of a youth pastor. And he was talking, and he was talking about this kid, and he said this kid kept just acting up and acting up and acting up. He's like, so finally, I just reared back, and I clocked him one good time right in the gut and laid him in the floor. Sometimes you have to lay on holy hands. So, that guy's not qualified. If you ever want to put some holy hands on me, just do it at a slower pace. They're prudent. They show care for the future. They're good with their money. They're good with their time. They know what to do. They're wise. Because honestly, if you're not prudent with your own life, you're not going to be prudent with God's care. They're respectable. They're held in high regard in the community. They don't have a bad name. Honestly, that's one of the burdens that has fallen on my shoulders, is that the Stevens family has a good name in Ringgold, as does the Wooten and the Pollard, which means I have to carry that on with my generation and then teach my kids, hey, we have a good name in this community and we're going to keep it. We're respectable. There's a big difference between respect and liking. I talked about Wednesday, speaking the truth, that people, they'll get mad at you over the truth, but because they're told lies so often, they will respect you for telling the truth. That's how it was at Amazon. They would get mad at me for telling them the truth. It reminds me of one time a guy coming to me and saying, Justin, I need some advice. I got my girlfriend pregnant and we're talking about whether to have the baby or have an abortion. And I told him, I said, you know that is a human life. He's like, yeah. He's like, I know it's a human life. That's why we're having the debate on it. And I just told him, is murder worth convenience. Because that's what it is. It's a murder of convenience. And of course, he got kind of mad at me and then came to me a few days later and was like, "You're right. You're absolutely right." So it's one of those things of, I may not like you, but boy, do I respect you. We're respectable. Doesn't mean we're going to be liked. We're hospitable. We're charitable. We're not greedy with our money. That's reserved for Judas. And we talked about where that got him. Hanging out. They're hospitable. They're able to teach. Honestly, this is the most neglected qualification for an elder. I've seen so many leaders in churches that know nothing. I mean, nothing. Base level knowledge, and they know nothing. That's a disqualification. If you can't teach me something about this word, you're disqualified. They're not addicted to wine. You don't necessarily have to be a teetotaler, just don't be addicted. I'm going to extend that to all idols. Don't have anything. That's adultery. Don't be pugnacious. Don't be ready to fight. You got to be gentle. Y'all know the rest of it. Godly leadership. It's good to be in leadership in a church. It's not for everybody. Only if you're God called. So God makes kings rise and fall. Why should we do his job of choosing church leaders? Let God choose them. If we seek after who we want instead of who God called, God may do like he did to Israel. Give them exactly what they wanted. And then, just like with Saul, we'll fail.